Hi everyone, this is Monica, and this is my second video of our discussion of the book The Fallen, the Sons of God, and the Nephilim. And last week we did the intro and chapter 1, so this week we're going to be doing chapter 2, which is the Sethite view. And it's basically just an overview of the Sethite view. And then the author goes into greater detail later on in the book. So, all right, so let's just jump into it. The Sethite view was the dominant view from the 5th to the 20th century. And again, we're studying the passage in Genesis chapter 4, verse... No, that's not right. I'm sorry, Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And so the reason for their view is because they believe that the Hebrew term Bene Ha-Elohim, which translates to the sons of God, means the male descendants of Seth, who was the son of Adam. Chapter 5 deals with the genealogy of Adam and points to the long lives of everyone. Everyone that was mentioned was over 900 years old, and except for Enoch, who got taken up, and Lamech, who died in his 700s. He brings up a couple verses about Enoch, and the first is Genesis 5:23, and it says, "And all the days of Enoch were 365 years." And verse 24 says, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." Okay, so then it also brings up Enoch in Hebrews 11:5, and it says, "By faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained witness that before he was being taken up, he was pleasing to God." That was out of the New American Standard Version. So basically they're using Enoch as an example of the godly line of Seth. So just sort of restating, the Sethite view argues that the men from the line of Seth are the sons of God in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Okay, so next up, the author mentions 3 biblical scholars who support the Sethite view. The first is H.C. Leopold, who wrote a couple volumes about Genesis, just sort of an evaluation of Genesis. And he stated that the sons of God are Sethites without a doubt. So basically that was the only quote from H.C. Leopold that Tim Chaffey uses. But I did look him up, and I found an online library that has his works, and I will put the link in the description so that if you're interested, you can look up his works, and it's free. Okay, so the second one is Paul P. Enns, who was a theologian and appears to have written several books. And he quotes Enns here saying, while there is considerable controversy over the identification of the sons of God, it seems best to the overall context to suggest that the sons of God refer to the godly line of Seth, while the daughters of men refers to the ungodly line of Cain. So that's pretty straightforward. The author doesn't provide any kind of backup to why Enns believes that, but maybe he'll discuss it further later in the book. Okay, then there's Julius Africanus, and I did a little digging. Um, he was apparently the first one to come up with the Sethite view, and referred to the descendants of Seth as the sons of God, rather than them being supernatural beings. Um, and for reference, he lived around AD 160 to 240. Um, so he believed that the men from Seth's line were righteous all the way through the Savior. And the descendants of Cain were the seed of men, signifying their lack of divine connection due to the wickedness of their line. I couldn't find any reasoning for this, but I did find that he did acknowledge that there were different views on this, but he didn't, he didn't really think that they held any any weight, I guess. So let me read a quote from him. This is from Julius. When men multiplied on the earth, the angels of heaven came together with the daughters of men. In some copies I found the sons of God. What is meant by the Spirit, in my opinion, is that the descendants of Seth are called the sons of God on account of the righteous men and patriarchs who have sprung from him, even down to the Savior himself. But that the descendants of Cain are named as the seed of men as having nothing divine in them on account of the wickedness of their race and the inequality of their nature, being a mixed people, and having stirred the indignation of God. But if it is thought that these refer to angels, we must take them to be those who deal with magic and jugglery, who taught the women the motions of the stars and the knowledge of things celestial, by whose power they conceived the giants as their children, by whom wickedness came to its height on the earth until God decreed that the whole race of the living should perish in their impiety by the deluge. Okay, so there's a lot there. So looking at the second part of the statement, I think it's interesting that he says that we must take the belief of them being angels, that they must be those who deal with magic. So he's basically saying that they're men like magicians, not angels. But why must we believe they that they were magicians? Why can't we believe that they were angels? I don't know. If they were fallen angels, they would inherently have some power and a lot of knowledge that the humans didn't have. And I suppose that would seem like magic. Um, but I don't know why you would automatically have to assume they weren't angels. Okay, so in the first part of the quote, Julius is saying that Seth's line is good and Cain's line is bad. And when they married and had offspring, the flesh was corrupted, and they were just evil, and that's when evil began to manifest um, wholeheartedly, I guess, on the earth and throughout the world. So on the topic of who the Nephilim were, there seems to be some disagreement. Some believe they were already on the earth when the marriages were happening. And my question is, where did they come from? So I don't know how they'd already be on the earth, but others believe that they were the offspring of the unions. Others believe they were giants, while others do not. So it's kind of just all over the place. and they can't really get a grip on who they think the Nephilim are. So in the "they were not giants" camp, they attempt to connect the Hebrew verb naphal, it's Naphal, which generally means to fall. So they would say that the Nephilim were those who had fallen away from God, morally speaking. Or, in verse 4, I guess it describes them of men as renowned or mighty men, so maybe warriors, and so they would fall upon their enemies. But basically, the belief is that these marriages of unbelievers to believers led to the pursuit of evil. So God sent the flood, and to destroy everyone except for Noah. So let's see, there's positive arguments. Chaffey points out 3 supporting arguments for the Sethite view. The first support would be the genealogies of Cain and Seth immediately precede Genesis 6 and Genesis 4 and 5. Also, in the New Testament, believers are called sons of God. And so there was 2 examples of those. Let's see. I lost my, oh no, here it is. The first is in Romans 8:14. For as many are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. Okay, and then Galatians 3:26. For ye are all the children of God by faith in Jesus Christ. And then I looked in my some cross references, and Matthew 5:9 calls the peacemakers the sons of God. John 1:12, the believers are sons of God. Revelation 21:7, he who overcomes is the son of God. And then Galatians 4 and 5. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Okay. So there's a bunch of other cross-references that you can probably look up if you're interested in doing that. But we're going to move on to the third positive argument, which is that it was the most popular view from the 5th to 20th centuries. And while we shouldn't base our acceptance on the longevity of the belief, and just because it was the most popular one, we should at least find out what the reasons are for the belief. Okay, so next up is the evaluation of the positive arguments. And Chaffey states that this view is not as strong as it seems. There are strong arguments against it from history, theology, and most importantly, he says, from the scripture itself. So we start out with the church history. Even though this theory dominated for so long, it was not the first theory. Okay, there were 2 other theories prior to the Sethite view. So this raises some important questions of why were other views taught prior to the Sethite view, and how did this view come about in the first place. The author notes that these questions will be dealt with more in chapter 16. Okay, the next one is the sons of God in the New Testament. While sons of God is used in the New Testament, it doesn't necessarily support the Sethite view for a couple of reasons. And I'm going to read out the first one. It says, the way in which sons of God is used in the New Testament may actually support one of the supernatural views, since believers' true identity as sons of God will not reach its full expression until they are like angels in heaven. That is, even the New Testament uses the sons of God. Use of sons of God can be understood as a reference to beings that have received glorified bodies and are capable of dwelling in the heavenly realm. So Chaffey doesn't give any verse references here, and it says it'll be discussed later on in chapter 13. And I'm not sure I agree with this necessarily. So it's, the Bible seems to imply that we are the children of Yah through the Holy Spirit, okay, at this moment. So, not that we have to wait until we're like angels. So I don't know, but hopefully it'll be explained better in chapter 13. Okay, so then the second is the New Testament was written in Greek, while the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and there could be an issue of translation. There's no linguistic law that states that phrases in different languages have to match. Okay, so the Old Testament identifies the term Bene Ha-Elohim as angelic beings. So I looked up AI on AI Assist, and it said Bene Ha-Elohim translates to sons of God in Hebrew and is a term used in the Bible in Genesis 6 verses 2 and 4 and the book of Job, often interpreted to refer to angels or divine beings. So if we look at Job 38 verse 7, it says that the sons of God shouted for joy as God created the world. And I really like this verse. It kind of gives you a feel-good feeling. But it says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So that kind of makes, I don't know, that gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling. Okay, so the point is that the sons of God refer to heavenly beings because men were not created yet. Okay. Okay, so the next evaluation is Cain's and Seth's descendants. So on the surface, it seems like using the claims of virtue or character of the descendants of Cain kind of hold up. But aside from being listed in chapter 5, the scriptures don't really say much about anybody. So, the Sethite view proposes the sons of Yah were the godly men from the line of Seth who married the supposedly wicked daughters from the supposedly wicked daughters from the line of Cain. So two questions about this. One would be, where does it say in the Bible that the men of Seth were godly, and where does it say in the Bible that the women of Cain's line were wicked? The genealogies in chapter 4 and 5 don't really go into very much detail. So in Genesis 4:26, it mentions Seth's son, and I believe it's pronounced Anus. And when he was born, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Anus. Then began men to call upon the name of Yahuwah. So I think it's a little strange that it would take till the third generation for them to start calling the name of Yahuwah, since, it's only the third generation after Adam was created. So, but I don't know. I don't know how that would work. But anyway, it doesn't say that it was only Seth's line, because it says, then began men to call upon the name of Yahuwah. So, I mean, it mentions Seth being, oops, I mean, it says it's mentioned in Seth's line. So I guess you could assume that, they were godly men. So, anyway, but several generations later, the world was very different and men were exceedingly wicked and violent. However, Enoch, Anus's great-great-grandson, was a prophet and walked with Yah. So Enoch is also in the line of Seth. So I can understand why they would assume that, they were more godly. So there were a couple verses here. I already read Hebrew 5 or 11:5, and then there's Jude uh, verse 14, and it said, and Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints. So him being a prophet prophet of God would sort of, imply that he was a godly man. I would, I would think. And so then we have Genesis 24, which I read earlier, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Okay, so then the third one, also in Seth's line, was Noah. And so he was righteous and also walked with Yah. We have Genesis 6:9. Turn the page here. Okay. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Okay. So then there's I'm sorry, I forgot about Genesis 7:1. And Yahuwah said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee I have seen righteous before me in this generation. Okay, so he's obviously a man of God, and also in Seth's line. So, but most of the others mentioned in the genealogies, there's not much to say about them. So, they could have been godly men, and maybe not. But we know by the time Noah came, he was the only one. He was the only righteous man. The author also brings up Noah's father, Lamech, stated in Genesis 5:29, that Yahuwah had cursed the ground. But it doesn't say that Lamech followed Yah. So 5:29. I'm going to read 28 and 29. And Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, this same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which Yahuwah hath cursed. And then it just goes on to saying how old he was when he died. So it doesn't say that, Lamech was a godly man. It just basically says that, he believed in God. So this is kind of a gray area for me. And I kind of just agree with the author that it is speculation that Seth's line was godly. It mentions 3 of them, and by the time of Noah, he was the only one. So the rest of Seth's line obviously were not godly. So so let's see. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, there's apparently a theological system called the covenant theology. That did I say theological system? That's what I meant to say. There's called the covenant theology, that defines the human divine relationship through a series of covenants made with certain men by Yahuwah. Based on the covenant theory, it assumes that the point of highlighting these two generations, or I'm sorry, these two genealogies in Genesis 4 and 5, is to contrast the wicked people, which is Cain's line, with Yah's covenant people, which is Seth's line. But there's really nothing in the text that would indicate that Yah has a covenant with Seth or even with Adam. So this is an assumed idea. So what do we know about Cain's line? And were they evil? We know that Cain was ungodly because he killed his brother Abel. And then we also know that Lamech, which is his great grandson, killed a young man and boasted about it to his wives. So that's in Genesis 4:19 through 24. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain, Naamah. And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding. So the man wounded him, and so he killed him, and a young man that hurt him. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Okay, so we know Cain was ungodly. Lamech appears to be ungodly. But other than that, there's not much information on any other men in Cain's line. And also, I find interesting in chapter 4, it talks about how Yah protects Cain, because God boots him out, and so Cain is worried about being killed by everyone, and so God puts a mark on him so that people won't kill him. So he was he was protected by God. So that I find that interesting. He was ungodly, but God protected him. So okay, another problem with the Sethite view is that we don't know anything about the women of Cain's descendants. I just read the only mention of women, which were Lamech's wives and his daughter. Of course, I was wondering, why do they bring them up? I normally feel like if something is mentioned in the Bible, that it's significant, and so I'm not sure what was significant about mentioning them. Um, maybe something was taken out of the Bible. I don't know, but anyway. So, and what another point would be, what about all the other lines that came from Adam? He and Eve had other sons and daughters. And it states that in Genesis 5:4. So were his other offspring, were they godly or ungodly? Did they mix with the line of Cain? And where do they fit into the Sethite view? Maybe since they don't mention the names in the genealogy, um, maybe the Sethite view holds them as unimportant. I don't know. But by the time the sons of God came into the daughters of men, there were several generations and several different lines. And so where did they all fit in? The Sethite view essentially ignores all those people and solely focuses on the line of Cain. And that only mentions one daughter. So it seems reasonable to me that you wouldn't exclude all the other women from all the other lines, but the Sethite view entirely disregards them. So another problem with the Sethite view is explaining why, if men from Seth's line were so godly, why would they continually marry ungodly women generation after generation? There are examples of this happening, but I don't think it makes sense that just large amounts of Sethite men who are godly would just continually marry ungodly women. I don't. That doesn't make sense to me. And why only Cain's line? Why not from any of the other lines of Adam? Okay, so the Bible points to Noah being righteous in his generation, and it says several times that the world was corrupt and violent. So Seth's line wasn't mentioned. Noah's the only one. I think I mentioned this earlier, that Noah was the only one that was righteous. He doesn't say anything about anybody else from any other line, including Seth's line. And Noah is from Seth's line. So another objection the author brings is that in Genesis 11:5, Yahweh calls the people sons of men or children of men. And this is about when they were building the Tower of Babel. And it says, "And Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded." Okay, so he calls them children of men there. Excuse me. And just as a side note, the Hebrew word for men is the same used for Adam. So now Chaffey admits this isn't a watertight argument, and we can infer the sons of God are different than the sons of man, because God said it. He said they were sons of man, not sons of God. Another question is why Yahweh would deliver such a harsh judgment for believers marrying unbelievers. And I'm not sure that that's really what the Sethite view is saying necessarily. It's just that, they became so wicked. But in pre-flood, the Israelites were reprimanded for marrying non-Israelite women. But it wasn't until the time of Moses and when he did his law that it was strictly forbidden. And even then, the judgment only occurred if the godly man, married an ungodly woman and then turned from God into these pagan practices. Okay, so putting everything kind of in perspective, Chaffey says that there's a decisive argument against the Sethite view. And we're going to start a review of Genesis 6:1 1 through 4 passage. And let's see. Verse 1, it came about when mankind began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. And that's pretty clear, I think. Men multiplied and daughters were born. So this verse, though, is speaking of mankind in general. So there's no justification for thinking that the men were from only one line. So then we move on to verse 2, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took for themselves wives from any they chose. So the big question is, who are the daughters of men? Obviously, they're the daughters of men in verse 1. But the Sethite view changes the daughters of all men in verse 1 to the daughters of some men, namely Cain's line. So there's a commentator named Derek Kidner, and I'll put his link in the description box. He stated that the Sethite view violates the rules of language. And he's quoted as saying, the sons of God are identified by some interpreters as the sons of Seth, over against those of Cain. By others, including early Jewish writers, they are taken to mean angels. If the second view defies the normalities of experience, the first defies those of language, and our task is to find the author's meaning. For while the Old Testament can declare God's people to be his sons, the normal meaning of the actual term sons of God is angels, and nothing has prepared the reader to assume that men now means Cainites only. Okay, so if words are supposed to change meanings within a passage, there should be an indicator that that says that it's changing. Because if we can just change the meaning of words kind of willy-nilly, there's no effective communication. Okay, so and there in the verses 1 and 2, there's no explanation of a change in whose the daughters are. So between verses 1 and 2, it goes from mankind in verse 1 to Cain's line in verse 2. So the problem continues through verses 3 and 4. 3 says, and Yahuwah said, my spirit will not remain with man indefinitely, in that he is flesh. His days will be 120 years. So does verse 3 refer to man in a general sense or as the line of Cain? And I think clearly it refers to mankind. And the supporters of the Sethite view agree with that. But now they've gone from interpreting men in general in verse 1 to switching to Cain's line in verse 2, then switching back to men in general in verse 3. So the author makes note right here that more will be discussed on this in chapter 17. Okay, so verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, whenever the sons of God went into the daughters of men who bore to them children. They were the mighty men of antiquity, men of renown. Okay, so the Sethite view goes back to referring to sons, to daughters of men, to the line of Cain. Okay, so, and then in verse 5, which we didn't really cover too much, but it goes back to talking about mankind in general. So it says, and Yahweh saw that, what did I say? And Yahuwah saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Okay, so it goes back to talking about mankind again. So it just kind of jumps back and forth, and Chaffey points out that the Hebrew word for man is used as a collective, which also in English you can use man as, you know, a collective of mankind. There's also a Bible translation. It's called the New English Translation, which uses humankind in all the instances in this passage. And I looked it up on BibleGateway.com, and it does say humankind throughout the space, or throughout the passage. Okay, so in conclusion, even though the Sethite view held dominance for several centuries, and still has many supporters today, Chaffey says none of the arguments that support this view seem to hold much weight. And even with seeming support from the New Testament, the references end up supporting one of the supernatural views. The Sethite view doesn't adequately explain the existence of the Nephilim. I think that if we go back to the quote from Julius Africanus, when he points out women using magic to conceive the giants, that's really the only kind of solid explanation they give of who the Nephilim are. And that's just my kind of observation. Okay, so number 4, this view fails to provide the basis of the world being destroyed. So, you know, they do say that the world was really wicked, and it seems to infer that it was wicked because of the marriages. So, but I don't, that's hard to fathom. But, okay, so, and lastly, it arbitrarily interprets the same term, man or men, differently in consecutive verses. So, that's it. So, that's kind of a lot to take in. Hopefully you can buy the book, and I'll leave his link in the description box again. But it really is interesting, I feel. So, and I hope you found this interesting. And if you did, please leave a like and a comment. I'd like to, you know, hear different views from different people. And in my next video, we're going to be discussing Chapter 3, which is the royalty view, which is the one about where they view rulers as divine. So that'll be in the next one. And thanks for joining me, and see you next time. Bye.